Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dr. Yaprak Onat, Assistant Director of Research at CIRCA, and I'm happy to welcome you to CIRCA's research webinar series. In the following 3 weeks, you're going to learn about the CIRCA-funded projects to improve the climate resiliency. We are kickstarting our event today with Dr. Miriah Kelly. She is an Assistant Professor of Environmental Science in Department of Environment, Geography, and Marine Sciences in Southern Connecticut State University. She focuses on the human dimensions of ocean climate change issues. Dr. Kelly works in the area of environmental management and decision-making and studies collaborative and transdisciplinary approaches to addressing complex environmental problems. She is going to talk about today the stakeholder evaluation to inform large-scale resilience planning. Just to give you a little bit of webinar logistics, you are all muted and you can type your questions anytime during the webinar to chat box or Q&A box, and we will have time to answer all of them. Without further ado, Dr. Kelly, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Onat, and thank you, CIRCA, for hosting this seminar series. I'm really excited to be here today to share with you what we've been working on. And I'm just going to share my screen here, and hopefully you all can see that.
We can see it.
Great. Okay, so it's a quite a balmy day here in Connecticut. So thank you all who are joining us for this live, and hopefully people can check in afterwards to watch this presentation. And because this is going to be a really brief presentation about a really big body of work that we've been working on for a couple of years now. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to keep it pretty simple. I'm going to focus on some of the big takeaway messages and conclusions that we generated from this research. And really, this project was an effort to do something quite novel in that we wanted to take more of a regional, broad, diverse perspective in terms of our stakeholder assessment approach. Because we know that in the Fairfield County region and New Haven County, those communities are diverse, and there are a lot of different organizations that are working as actors in that region that we wanted to hear from and consider in our assessment of how organizations are responding to and preparing for coastal resilience and coastal resilience hazards. So today I'm going to give you a little bit of a background. I'll talk about the methods we used. I'll give you some high-level findings, and then some big conclusions, some big takeaway messages. And really, one of the reasons why I got involved in the Resilient Connecticut project in the first place was because from the get-go, this is a project that really sought to engage stakeholders in new and innovative ways around coastal resilience planning. And so, given my background, it just made a lot of sense to start working with the group, just start thinking about how do we think more broadly about who the stakeholders are in this region and what they think and feel about coastal resilience. And so we developed a protocol for collecting organizational scale assessment information from broad and diverse stakeholders throughout the two-county region. One of the things I want to point out here that was really important about our study is that we took an organizational scale assessment approach rather than looking at individual responses. So the nature of our assessment was that we were really looking for organizations to respond on behalf of that organization so that we could get a much deeper vision about what might be happening in terms of coastal resilience at that organizational scale. And just to throw in a little bit of theory there in a citation, because I wouldn't be a good academic if I didn't, we were really relying on the work of Michael Quinn Patton and the utilization-based framework approach to doing evaluation. And really a lot of what we were trying to hone in on for this research is answering questions that were going to be useful for making decisions in the Resilient Connecticut project. So one of the things that we did initially, it was a bit of a labor of love, I'll be honest, but it was a really important labor of love because it's something that is often overlooked when stakeholder assessment is done. We did a lot of work to make sure that we had compiled a really broad and diverse list of organizations from our two-county study region. And so initially, we had looked to the literature and our own experience to develop what was a macro list of organizations that was 8 organizational typologies in the end. Then we populated that list to come up with a really long list of meso-organizations or organizational types that might be considered in doing coastal resilience planning. And that effort yielded 72 different organizational types that one might consider as stakeholders when doing coastal resilience planning in our region, which is a really important finding and a valuable finding for others who might want to try to diversify and broaden their stakeholder engagement efforts as well. We had a whole collaborative community check-in process with our partners to make sure that we had developed an appropriate list. We vetted that list with them, and then we finally eventually populated it with the actual contact information for the individuals that we eventually sent our survey to. So the timeline for it has really taken place over this last year. And as you know, with COVID, it's always been a bit of a gamble doing our work in this era. But we were really happy that we actually were able to successfully implement the survey. So we finalized the list in the fall. We immediately, survey was released following that. It was open for 2 weeks. 3 reminders were sent to participants before it was closed. Then over the holidays, we compiled the data, cleaned it, and started to glean out some initial key findings just so we could start to maybe use the data a little bit. And then we conducted more in-depth quantitative analysis and more in-depth qualitative analysis. And we have just recently arrived at a final report. And so what I'm saying to you with this is that there is a much bigger report that will be available soon. And I'm just going to kind of highlight some of the main findings from that effort here. And really, because we wanted to use the information gleaned from our survey research to understand what was going on with stakeholders out there, we wanted to know, how do different stakeholders want to be engaged and participate in this coastal resilience planning process. And then we also wanted to know if they actually differed by the type or the phase of adaptation that their organization is in. And then this last one, we wanted to know what was the relatedness or correlations between the stage of climate planning and then resilience topic priorities, organizational understanding matrix responses, and the types of resources that respondents need. And so just that analysis alone yielded many, many pages of data that we then interpreted and boiled down to kind of get these takeaway messages. So again, we collaboratively developed the survey, we generated our sampling pool, we piloted the survey for clarity. Of course, we always want to make sure we pilot our surveys and make sure they work, especially when you're using a software system like Qualtrics, which is how we distributed the survey. So anytime you're using digital technology, it's really important to make sure it all works properly. So we went through all those phases and eventually distributed the survey out. In the end, we collected 128 surveys from 128 different organizations, and we resulted in a response rate of 29%, which is fairly good, especially given the COVID times. And then we pulled all of the data all of the quantitative data out of Qualtrics and uploaded it into the Statistical Package for Social Scientists, which is also known as SPSS. And that's where we then cleaned the data. We ran descriptive statistics on all of our variables. We ran chi-square tests on categorical variables. And where possible, we ran correlational tests on our ordinal variables. And we also had collected a number of responses from our qualitative data and set from open-ended questions that we had asked in the survey. And we simply used the Qualtrics coding system that's embedded in the software to use an open coding process and create tags for all of the qualitative data. And then those were interpreted to arrive at qualitative data finding conclusions. So a little bit about what we found, because this is, interesting to me, and I hope it's interesting to you. So one of the things that we found is this is the makeup of our respondents and the types of organizations that they came from. And so you can see there how the breakdown is of who answered the questions in our survey. When we asked organizations where they were in terms of their phase of adaptation, which we did define for them in the actual survey, we found that actually about 21% are not adapting at all to climate change. And many are still in that understanding and planning phase, with a small group still in that about 30% in that implementing and monitoring phase of adaptation. And so really, if you look at this graphic, it's that there's still a significant number across the board of people not adapting or still in that understanding phase. And when we asked about level of interest, we found that, for the most part, half of our respondents were very interested in what was going on. And then about half were a little bit lukewarm, interested, but not necessarily eager in talking about coastal resilience planning. When we asked them about the level of priority that the organization gives to climate resilience, this was really interesting because of the organizations we surveyed, close to 62% said that the coastal resilience or climate resilience is a major priority or a high priority for them. And yet, if you look back to our previous graphic, only 33% are actually implementing or monitoring. And so this shows that, there are a lot of organizations out there that have climate resilience as a really high priority, but they have not been able to get into that implementation or monitoring phase yet. And when we asked our participants to tell us what they think the priorities are related to climate or coastal resilience, this is what they told us. And I guess based on the population of our survey respondents, we weren't surprised to see that socially and economically vulnerable populations was considered a really large priority based on the organizations we surveyed. Also, people were really prioritizing infrastructure damage, public health and safety, and coastal erosion. So in our main conclusions and findings, those four priority areas are the ones that were expressed most by the organizations we surveyed. We then ran a series of correlational tests on a number of matrix variables we had in the survey, looking at organizational understanding and information needs. What we found when we asked about organizational understanding is that as organizations get farther along in the adaptation process, their understanding is being met. So they're actually increasing their understanding, except for in the area of socially and economically vulnerable populations. And so in this variable, or in this question, we found that this area of interest, or the socially and economically vulnerable populations, could be an area to develop for organizational understanding. We also asked about their level of adaptation and their climate vulnerability information needs, and if they're being met. What we found is that for the most part, all of these information needs are being met, but we identified a series of different areas where more information could be useful, including shoreline change in Connecticut, social vulnerability of Connecticut residents, economic vulnerability of Connecticut residents. Again, you see that theme come up again. Information about communicating climate risk specific to Connecticut and also more generally. So again, an interest in information, or a demonstration of information needs around these topical areas by the organizations we surveyed. And we also found, this was pretty interesting, that when it came to the vulnerability information needs, we found a series of areas that were of interest. But when we came to the resilience and adaptation information needs, we didn't find any, actually. So, kind of in conclusion here is that these information needs are being met, especially as organizations get farther along in the adaptation process. And then a little bit on our qualitative findings, some interesting things that we took away from what we read, is that a lot of organizations are already doing a lot, or they don't know what to do to become more climate resilient. And, you know, when we looked at the list of what organizations around the state of Connecticut are doing to become more climate resilient, we came up with a list of 32 different unique things that people identified when we asked them what they're doing. And that list could be really valuable as well to really get a handle on people's perceptions about how they are contributing to a more climate resilient coastline in our area. Also, respondents are unsure on how to improve climate resources. So I think there's, you know, a group out there that's sort of like, I think I should be doing something about this, but maybe need to have more information to know what it is I should be focused on. And in some of the qualitative findings, we also saw that there was an interest in more streamlined resources. I know one of our big findings from our report too is that people really love the Resilience Roundup because it is providing those streamlined resources in a one-stop shop kind of format where you get a lot of information in one piece of communication. And people seem to appreciate that. Not surprisingly, we found that the biggest barrier was funding, and also lack of staff was another barrier, which also I think is related to funding. And so we've come across this a lot, but we also had a lot of respondents say that if that funding was available, that they are at a stage where they've done enough planning and they know what they want to do, they just have to get to that implementation phase. So maybe an indication there that additional funding could actually help people move from the planning to the actual implementation phase. So in terms of conclusions, some big takeaways here. Organizational interests. Most respondents want to interact with Resilient Connecticut around the Resilience Roundup, as well as attend virtual and in-person summit events. We did find that different subgroups vary in terms of the different aspects of Resilient Connecticut outreach, which in terms of a big finding is that we know that stakeholder organizations are different, but in our survey research, we found that they actually do have different preferences for communication. In terms of level of adaptation, we found that 20% of respondents indicated that they're not currently involved. And so we believe that this is a really important target group to try to engage, at least in terms of increasing awareness and knowledge about the issues, and maybe get them more involved in finding ways and resources to begin that planning and understanding process. And that 60% of participants say that climate resilience is a high priority, which is great. And we love that our organizations responded back that it is a high priority. The only 33% are actually implementing and monitoring. And certainly, you know, at the Resilient Connecticut project, we're trying to work to close that gap. And in terms of priorities, you know, that top priority area of socially and economically vulnerable populations came up a couple of times. And so making sure that that priority area is at the forefront of decision making is really important to make sure that stakeholder expressed interests and priorities that were measured through the survey are actually attended to in that decision making process. And then, you know, priorities really based on the phase of adaptation are different. So depending on if you're in that understanding phase versus the monitoring phase, organizational priorities are going to be expressed differently by that different phase. In terms of information needs, we identified these 5 areas, including shoreline change in Connecticut, social vulnerability of Connecticut residents, and economic vulnerability of Connecticut residents, and then information about communicating climate risks in Connecticut and also generally. And so these could be important topical areas for additional knowledge building of our constituencies and partners and collaborators to really understand you know, what's going on in terms of these concepts and topics. And then that is all I have. So I've got a minute and a half left to say thank you. And I also want to make sure that I give a proper thank you and shout out here to my fantastic graduate student, Julia Stephen, who's been my right-hand woman through all of this. And I'm really proud of the work that she produced for us, and a really great experience for her and myself. And we really look forward to building on this in the future and sharing with you all of the tools that will be coming out as a result of this work now that we're kind of wrapping up this first year here. So thank you again, and I guess we'll take questions in the chat box.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kelly. This was very informative, and to see like how different stakeholders like giving like what kind of information and how they are like closer to the more into the phase of the climate vulnerability, and that they have like more concerns and about it. So while everybody is writing their chat also, like let's go to the questions. Some of the information needs that you've been talking about, that's like the shoreline change, social vulnerability, like the points that you didn't find really the correlation that you mentioned, that there needs to be more research needed. Do you think that this kind of surveying research needed for for all the stakeholder groups, or like have you identified some specific stakeholder groups that needs to be asked those questions to get like more correlation?
You know, I think in terms of the strategy going forward and thinking about the, breaking out organizations by their phase of adaptation can then help then go to those groups individually and say, okay, so do we really need to improve your information needs around these things? And I actually believe that one of the best ways to do that would be either through interviews or focus groups rather than in a survey form, as we've done to, we really use the survey because we wanted to get, as broad and diverse response as possible. But I think if we're going to hone in on those information needs, targeted interviews with key stakeholders could be really valuable for better understanding what those information needs are, but also, more specifically, why are they struggling with those things, and how, in what ways can we use our resources to actually help them make a difference with that.
Mm-hmm. That sounds like actually a much better approach, like more fine-tuning into the information. Yeah, that's good. Another question that we have is, of course, about pandemic. Since you have your the research done during the pandemic time and got actually a very good response rate, do you think that it will actually skew your data or information that you get into the one field of stakeholders versus another field of stakeholders? And do you think that will change significantly if it wouldn't be a pandemic time?
Well, it's been really tough to try to operate, and just as in the field of social science in general has been just completely upended in the past few years, not just by the pandemic, but also by technological advances and just pressures on people to, provide their information so much more often than we used to have to. And so survey research in general is flawed in some ways because, you can only do your best. And what really, when we made the call to just continue with the survey, we just said, we're just going to do our best because we know that even if we get some information, it's more valuable than not having any information. But what I think we actually found in the end, and what I think has been a societal result of COVID is, and also just what's been going on in terms of society through all kinds of different social movements that have been occurring this year. I think that those things influence the fact that we found that socially and economically vulnerable populations are a big priority? Yeah, I do. But I do think that we're coming out of COVID with a society that is more concerned about socially and economically vulnerable populations. And so, I think looking at what happened throughout this year and then looking at our findings, they follow, and it makes sense. And I do think they are still valid, especially because we did have such a strong response rate. And, our findings too are really important and valuable for actual use, and, trying to take the information that we have available to us to make informed decisions based on data.
Mm-hmm. We have another question that says, like, what input have you had from Audubon Connecticut and Menankatuk Audubon Society?
I haven't had any, I can't express who actually participated in our survey because I'm not allowed to say who did. But I will say that we did send that survey to organizations throughout our region. So I personally have not done targeted effort to gather feedback from those particular organizations.
Okay. In Connecticut, we also have a Governor's Council of Climate Change movement is going on. So do you think that your research can be expanded to include all Connecticut's and then get the responses, or what would your approach would be?
Yes, I mean, we did this survey to focus on Fairfield and New Haven counties because that's the study region. But I do believe that a statewide survey of this kind that has generalizable findings from a randomly selected target population would be really valuable. And also just, we're thinking about coastal resilience in this project, but there are a lot of other resilience related topics that organizations around the state are working on. And so I think, I mean, I would love the state of Connecticut to take up an actual survey of organizations to find out, where are all of our organizations at with this stuff? What do they think and feel about it? What kinds of resources do they need? I mean, we know that for our purpose because we're working in this study region. And that was it was a lot of work to arrive at that. But, certainly if we did it at the state level, it would be incredibly informative for then knowing how to work within, where people are already, rather than just making assumptions about how they think and feel or what they need, and then operating from that as a basis. Rather than just making assumptions about it, we at least have some data to inform us where are our people and where, what do they need?
Yeah, and then do you think that the levels that you arranged that for the stakeholders, considering the whole Connecticut, will be the same, but just like putting the stakeholders into the categories?
Yeah, I'm actually really excited about what we call CRISIF, the Coastal Resilience Stakeholder Inventory Framework. We have submitted an article to publish the tool because we do hope that other people will use the organizational typology that we developed, which is inclusive of 72 different types of organizations, that anybody like Resilient Connecticut, like the state, like any organization out there can go and look at this list and be like, okay, is this type of organization one that is a stakeholder for what we're trying to accomplish? Yes, 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 yes. And then you can start to generate your own list, your own diverse, robust, broad list of who your stakeholder groups might be. And this typically, it's not typically done this way. So that's why it's really exciting. And it's been awesome for Resilient Connecticut to support something that is a little bit more forward thinking than the average stakeholder assessment process. Because I think by taking that extra time to come up with the framework that we did, it will hopefully add value to other organizations around the state.
Okay, and we have another question. If another organization wanted to conduct a needs assessment, what issues do you think the most valuable extension of your work?
Well, I mean, it would depend on the type of organization, what their goals are, what they're trying to measure, really. I mean, there's all different kinds of constructs we measure in social science, and it could be things like attitudes or beliefs, or it could be interests and needs, information needs. It could be preferences or priorities. There's all different things that can be measured. And really, every time I do a project like this, it's very much about what is the focus of that organization, what is the focus of the research, and where do we want to hone in on. But certainly, for organizations right now, just to tap into their stakeholders and find out what are those resilience priorities that they're interested in, or the resilience topical areas that they might be interested in, I think could be a good way for organizations to start to tap into, at least conceptually, where their stakeholders' brains are going when they're thinking about coastal resilience.
Mm-hmm. And I'm looking for the last questions because we are on top of the time. When would we be able to see the content of the report?
Katie?
Well, soon. This
Yeah,
was the
soon.
summer.
The report has been prepared. There's also a high-level executive summary. And so we'll be I don't know, maybe within the month.
Yes, I would say that within a month. Right now that you can reach the information, I'm going to actually share the screen for everybody. When you go to the webinar series, you can see that Dr. Kelly is under that. You can reach the summary information for the fact sheets. The reports will be within a month. Now it's in the review process, and then you'll be able to reach that. So I see that we don't really have any other questions right now. And thank you so much, Dr. Kelly. I just want to remind everybody that if you miss any part of this presentation, that you can see it. We are going to upload it to our YouTube channel tomorrow. And we are hopefully going to see you in our next webinar on Wednesday, which is about like real estate values, tax revenues, and climate change induced retreat from flood zones. If you haven't registered to that, come here and register today. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.